Hello, everybody, and a big special hello to Jane McGonigal, author of Imaginable. I remember when we were trying to brainstorm the title for this book. I still love it. And also my identical twin sister. If anyone did not know that, you can now see. And I just wanted to start by saying, first of all, that, you and I have written a bunch of books. And I think that this is the best book that either of us, anyone with the name McGonigal, has ever written. It is so different than anything I've ever read. It's just so interesting. I can't remember the last time I read a nonfiction book where, like, every paragraph, my mind was being blown. Part of me was thinking this whole time I was reading it, first of all, how does Jane know all this stuff? And why has she not told me? Why am I just learning about this now from reading her book when you've known about all this strange and interesting and sometimes scary stuff that's happening in the world, and these amazing experiences that you've had talking to people in industry and interplanetary defense?
Well, planetary defense, not
planetary defense.
We're not expecting other planets to
look too far into the future there. Anyway, so I love this book, and so thank you for writing it. And I wanted to start off by riffing a little bit on something that is related to the name of our book club. So those people who are joining us, I chose this book for the Joy Collective. And, there's the word joy in the name of our book club. And one of the things that is really clear is that when a lot of people think about the future, and particularly the kinds of things that you're talking about in the future, things like the climate and economics and changes to politics and culture, that a lot of people, what they feel is not joy. It is fear, dread, anxiety, anger, outrage, hopelessness, despair, denial, avoidance, all of that. And yet your attitude throughout the book and just in your work in general is it's this mindset that you've talked about in previous works of being a gameful mindset, that you're game, that you say yes to reality, yes to the challenges, and at the same time meet those challenges with creativity and curiosity, an open mind, wanting to hear different perspectives, wanting to consider possibilities, and even emotions like hopefulness and compassion. So I guess I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that interesting paradox, because so many people feel one set of emotions, and you're bringing this really different mindset and attitude. I really think the book itself is like a mindset intervention in how to do that, but you didn't have this book to find that mindset.
Yep.
So how did you get there?
Right. I didn't have this book. What I had was years of training as a professional game designer. And I had my research into the psychology of gaming. And what I was seeing in gamers, by the way, I realized I'm getting a little bit of feedback, audio feedback, and I feel like I should have possibly headphones on.
I should too. Here, should we all?
Can you do a guided meditation for everyone?
We're all going to breathe for a second. Let's see if this works. Would everyone here watching live like to meet my cat? I can't remember if I've introduced any of my cats to the Joy Collective yet, but yes, every event I do, there's a cat on my lap. It's usually this cat. Her name is Moo. Moo's still looking at my lap like she wants to be on it. And I would love to hear in the chat if any of you have a pet with you. Give your pet a shout out. Who's your favorite lap?
And by the way, future of pets is one of my favorite future topics to discuss. So we could maybe come back to that. Yes, my headphones have gone missing. So I'm going to allow you to wear the headphones, and I think that will.
Yeah, my headphones aren't even working. I hear myself, and then I hear you through my computer. Clearly, this is not about the future of technology. We have this event that is happening.
Well, let me talk a little bit about game design in the future. So, when I started my research into gaming psychology, we would see people would react to these incredibly difficult challenges with so much creativity and flexibility, willingness to learn and ask for help. And, oh, and at the same time, as they were practicing all these really powerful mindsets and cultivating these skills, the gaming community started to wonder, could we use this to tackle maybe some real world challenges or do some good with these new skills, with this new collective intelligence, collective creativity, collective imagination? And I was curious to see maybe like what kind of new genres of games could we develop to facilitate this bridge between how optimistic we are that we can make a difference in a game, in a virtual world, and affect what happens next, and how maybe in real life we're not sure what are all of the moves that I can make, what are the positive outcomes, the win conditions that I can imagine when I just think that things seem like they're outside of my control, or maybe the futures I imagine, none of them feel like a win to me. And so I started developing this essentially a new genre of gaming, a type of future simulation where we could look at a future scenario and we could ask the same questions that we ask when we play games, like, what can I do in this world? What are my powers? What skills and strengths and abilities do I have? What do I feel called to create? Or who can I help? And to ask those questions about, strange futures that are almost as hard to imagine as, fictional game worlds. These are possibilities that we've never directly experienced, whether we're imagining, a pandemic before we actually lived through one, or we're imagining really radical climate action and what might we do as a planet to really create a sustainable future that's beyond anything we've experienced yet today. And so we have to travel to these possible worlds with the same openness and curiosity and willingness to experiment as we do when we just boot up a new video game.
And, I remember some of those early games that you were developing. I remember and being really impressed by what people were doing in real life, that playing these games, imagining these realities, it wasn't just a fantasy people had, but it was changing their real world behavior. And one thing that really stands out to me, I remember within World Without Oil, I remember that you told me people had started to do these like ninja gardens, like they were planting food all over the place. And I actually started to see some of them sprout up where I live, that there was like a pepper plant, a tomato plant growing in on this main street in like where they have the street poles and also dirt. And I just remember thinking like, it's so wonderful when imagining a scenario that we don't actually want can lead us to engage in behaviors that support us and support our community, whether or not that actual scenario unfolds.
Yes, so that was a game imagining a future oil crisis and imagining that we couldn't fuel our cars or our trucks to deliver food. And we were asking people, how would you feed yourself if you could only use ingredients that came from within a 5-mile or a 10-mile radius? And one of the things that players did was they figured, well, we better have some more food growing near us. And they went out and they're just like, putting seeds in the ground in land that didn't belong to them, but they started growing food there. And another thing that I heard players from that game were doing was thinking about living closer to loved ones. This idea of like being able to drive long distances to see friends and family maybe wouldn't make sense in a future where, whether it's an oil crisis or maybe a commitment to climate action or whatever might motivate us to want to actually be in physical proximity to the people we care most about. And people actually started moving. And that was a small group of players. So that was about 1,200 players. Interestingly, I think, as you know, just this month, this game received a Peabody Award. They called it a Legacy Award, which I interpret as this was more important than we realized at the time, because the game was in 2007 and it received the award in 2022. But what was great about it is that the award was for collaborative storytelling. So, we posed this fictional scenario about the future, and we asked people to tell us stories and to go document actions they were taking with these photos and videos. And so all 1,200 players, share in that Peabody Award, which makes me happy, because the future is it's something we co-create through all of our actions, right? There's no one person in charge of the future. And that same thing can be said for the stories we tell and the worlds that we imagine, so we can do this together.
Yeah. Hey, give us a shout out in the chat if you were one of those original players. By the way, speaking of the chat, thank you so much for all the pet references. Hello, pets
Rocco,
that are with us.
Snickers, Trooper.
I actually thought we could do a little scenario imagination. We're also going to be taking questions. I have some questions from the app that people submitted, but also you can enter some questions in the chat. We got like another 25 minutes together. But let's take like 5 or 10 minutes to do a bit of a scenario discussion. So Jane's going to explain a scenario. It's one that was in the book, and then ask us to reflect on how we would respond to it.
Yeah. So maybe I'll set it up and I'll read, a couple paragraphs to set this scene. And one thing I should say is, when I design future scenarios, I try to present them in a way that we could all imagine ourselves waking up in these worlds. They have this quality of, in a moment, something changes, and we have to reflect on how we would feel in that moment of sudden change, how we would react, who do we want to call first, or what actions do we want to take right away to feel ready or secure. And so this scenario will have that same quality, and all the scenarios in the book do. And this scenario, it's called the 10-year winter, and I created it because I feel like there's a real appetite in the world today for stories and visions of a future in which the world has taken really dramatic, effective climate action. What is the biggest scale action that we can realistically imagine the world taking that would actually allow us to kind of shed the fears of future climate change and really feel confident that we are going to be able to live on this planet and it will continue to be beautiful and Earth as we want it to be. So this is a scenario about dramatic collective action in which we've considered the possibility of geoengineering. So geoengineering just means we intentionally change the climate. And one strategy that has been suggested but is currently banned by the United Nations. And it's one reason why I wanted to write about it, because if we do want to take dramatic action, we probably need to, look at the legal structure around it and whether we, want it to be legal or not. But this strategy, it's called solar radiation management. You inject sulfate particles into the atmosphere. It mimics the geological effects of a really severe volcanic eruption where it sends all this ash into the sky. And in history, we've seen with real volcanic eruptions, it affects the global temperature, it affects weather patterns. And so scientists have predicted that if we were to inject sulfate particles in a controlled manner, we could lower the temperature of the planet and kind of buy ourselves enough time to become a totally carbon neutral, fossil fuel free society, everything green, everything solar, everything wind, but that we might need to block the sun for a decade or two while we make that effective transition. And one of the big questions around this technology is who should be allowed to start injecting those sulfate particles? Should the United States government have that authority? What if China wants to do it while we're still trying to figure out the ethics of it? What if an independent company wants to do it? This company develops the technology and they just say, we're going for it, wish us luck, Earth. And one of the things I like about imagining the future is we can give ourselves time, like enough runway to learn about the possibilities that are in front of us, to develop opinions that are informed, and to think about potential, unintended consequences, and just to prepare ourselves to participate. So there's this geoengineering scenario in the book and for everyone to imagine today, so that we can essentially put a little like alert signal in our brain, like pay attention. If you hear anybody talking about solar radiation management, this is something you are called to pay attention to and inform yourself about.
Well, one of the things that I really loved about this scenario in the book is that you also, you're describing how it's unfolding and that people decided that younger people deserve to vote. And I thought like that was such a really important part of this reflection in, this is probably something that we should be thinking about as a society in general, in giving a vote and a voice to people who live with the consequences of some of the big decisions we're making. But go ahead. So imagine that.
So this scenario is about a global election to decide. And by the way, we use these signals of change. Professional futurists use signals of change to create scenarios. So a signal of change is like a real example of something already happening or a policy already being proposed, that we can look at that signal and say, well, if that became more commonplace or widespread or popular, what would the future be like? And there is actually a real signal of change today, where think tanks and policy groups are suggesting the minimum voting age should be 0. Babies should be allowed to be brought into. No, really, Google it. Babies.
This is what I love about you're always telling me stuff where I'm like, no, and then
you're going to be like,
and
yes.
I'm like, okay, I know babies shouldn't be able to vote, but you're going to probably convince me otherwise.
Google it. Babies should be able to vote. You're going to read an amazing op-ed that was in the New York Times that I found very persuasive. But the idea is that
I will look that up.
The youngest people will live for the longest with the consequences of our elections and our decision to act or failure to act on climate. And that if there's no maximum voting age, there should be no minimum voting age. So that's a real signal of change that did inspire the scenario. So maybe I'll read just a tiny little bit. So this is the 10-year winter, and it's about the election that we just had. You've been staring at the screen all night. You've refreshed it more than 100 times. It still says the same thing. Results pending. Refresh. The same 2 words. Refresh. Still no news. Refresh. You have to remind yourself to breathe. Refresh. There it is. Yes. So that's it. We're really doing this. The world voted yes. Yes to dimming the sun. Yes to geoengineering our way out of the climate crisis. In 2016, there was Brexit. In 2029, there was Cal exit. And now in 2033, the sun exit. It had to be a supermajority decision, more than 60%, because you don't do something as drastic as inject sulfate particles into the stratosphere without the consent of the people. And it was close. According to the results page, out of the 7.1 billion people who voted, 62% went yes, 38% no. It took nearly a year to get all the votes in. That in itself was a historic achievement, a secure election in nearly 200 countries, including places with no previous history of democracy and with kids eligible to vote too, because they had more on the line than anyone. Now there's a countdown clock on the screen. The 10-year winter begins in 10 days. So the scenario goes on from there, and it talks about what some of the consequences might be: cooling temperatures, cloudy skies, more rains, higher flood risks, possible mental health impacts, because in real history, when there have been severe volcanic eruptions, there have been global depressions, there's been food shortages because our agriculture is affected. So the scenario goes on to sort of explore what some of the impacts might be, and then asks the moment of choice, which every scenario has a moment of choice. You can start to think about what you would do. And the moment of choice for this scenario is tell a story about how you voted in the sun exit election. So would you have wanted to vote to authorize this experimental technology, take the risk, even though we don't know the possible consequences, and then tell the story about your reaction to hearing the results. And then another question is sort of, what do you do now that you know that we're turning off the sun in 10 days? How do you start to do?
So I would love to hear in the chat. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on this scenario, but I would love to hear in the chat, because one of the concepts you talk about in this book that I love is learned helpfulness, which is a play on the term learned helplessness, where people often feel so overwhelmed by their circumstances or by a situation that they feel like they can't do anything, and they just give up, have a total defeat response. And as you write, as soon as you turn your attention to who you can help, it activates hope and courage in a way that really can help you move out of that trap of despair, while also like actually improving things for yourself and for others. So I would love to hear in the chat, if you were in this scenario where this vote did pass, and you are now living in this world, as you describe, where there's significantly less sun and daylight and all of the problems that that could cause for physical health or mental health. And what would you do? So what is it that you think you could do in your everyday life, in your community, that might allow people to cope with this massive change, or allow people to come together, because you know there's going to be a lot of conflict about this decision. I wanted to say one thing, that when you asked, like, how would you vote, tell a story about it. It's interesting because I'm really risk averse. So I'm not like a new adopter with like anything. And I often think I'd rather not do something that could have a negative consequence, and that I would feel less guilt or less shame or less grief than if I actively did something that caused harm. So I was thinking, like, that's one of the things that would have, I don't know, I was like, oh, I'd want to hear from the scientists, like, and I need to hear more information. But I know that the thing in my personality that would be pulling me in a circumstance like that is anticipating, do I want to contribute to something that could have harm versus preventing harm? Anyways, but so let me tell you a little bit about what I was thinking I would do, because it really relates to the COVID pandemic too. And you often ask people, what is it that you like love more than other people? Or what is like a unique strength that you have? And that could be a starting point for how you respond to a major crisis or chaos. And I was thinking that if we were living without sun and people's circadian rhythms were really disrupted, then I know a little something about how to change mood and boost energy using music and using movement. And that I might dedicate myself to thinking about how to help people regulate their moods and their energy through listening to music and moving to music and exercising their bodies, to prevent some of the negative mental health consequences of losing sunlight. And it's interesting because that actually it ended up being my main coping response when COVID hit too. When everyone was trying to figure out how can I help, and there were people who were essential workers and I was not. I was like fired from every job that I had because nothing was essential apparently. And I thought, like, well, what could I actually do? And what I ended up doing was teaching outdoor dance classes eventually, but also making dance videos for people before we could even do that, to try to help people regulate their mental health through music and movement. So I think that one of the things that's really great about these scenarios is, even though right now I'm like looking back and saying that if I had done this scenario in advance, I think I would have been even more confident about making that choice during COVID. And it's one of the things I love about these scenarios is that you're previewing for yourself a way that you might contribute. Have you had that experience, or did you have that experience in COVID where you found that something you had, and also anyone else who wants to share in the chat, again, what you would do in this scenario to help, what your learned helpfulness would be. But I want to hear if you have a story, Jane.
Yes. Well, first of all, just for folks who are interested in playing with these ideas that you mentioned, there is a game that I teach people to play in the book called Pack Your Bags for the Future, where it doesn't matter what future disruption or crisis or opportunity you might encounter, that you're going to bring certain things to that future, certain skills, abilities, values, passions, and whatever world you wake up in, using those skills to be of service or acting in accordance with your values to do something that really feels meaningful. That will be how we thrive and survive in any encounter. So, you can I encourage people to just make a list and put it on the wall. It's because it's helpful, not just for the future, for every day. What do I care more about than most people? What do I know more about than most people? What, when I wake up every day, feels like my purpose. Like, I know that if I spend time today doing X, that I'll feel like I had a good day. All having that list, it helps us think today and, prepare for the future. But it's interesting. We were running pandemic simulations at the Institute for the Future, 2008, 2010. And one of the things that I imagined back then, you're getting ready to change our
I know I'm
circadian
about to
rhythms
go get
now.
ready to teach dance class, but I'm here. I'm good for now.
I love that. I was thinking about what I might do as somebody who had a connection with the game development industry, game design. What would game designers do during a pandemic? And I thought about the kind of stereotype of gamers as being, especially back in 2008, as being people who just stay at home in their basement. They don't like to go out or be social, and realized, of course, that staying at home is actually really a positive thing to do during a pandemic, and that if there were social games that could connect us and help us still feel like we had that social support and that social interaction that we crave, that it could help people follow quarantine or isolation or stay-at-home orders more effectively. And interestingly enough, I did have an opportunity in the real pandemic to support an initiative with the Electronic Software Association to promote gaming as a way to stay connected while at home. And early studies show that people who did have a gaming habit in that first year during the most severe shutdowns, especially young people, they did experience less social isolation, less loneliness, because they had that as an outlet. So,
And
so
they also
yeah,
had that experience already that you can connect to people through technology, which is something that a lot of people had to learn, that that
yeah,
connection could be just as real, even
yeah.
if it's mediated by technology. Um,
Oh, I see
I'm
what
reading some of the stuff that's
yeah.
going on in the chat. Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Um, one of the massive Zumba classes. Yes. Um, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you that came in from the app, um, about how to engage with these types of scenarios when you are imagining what you would do, or you're imagining yourself in that moment where something changes. Somebody had asked, what if you're one of those people who doesn't have visual
Mm,
imagery? You know, there
mhm.
are conditions where you close your eyes and you go to your mind's eye and there's no eye there. You're
Yeah.
not actually seeing anything. And there's often an assumption that to be able to imagine requires being able to visualize. And you talk about how there are changes in the brain that happen when you imagine something, and people
Mm,
often think that means you need to see it. And
mm.
I thought this was such a great question, because you and I had a discussion while you were writing the book in which you didn't even know that I don't have mental visual
Imagery. Yeah.
imagery.
Yeah.
I I close my eyes and there's nothing there that's visual. My entire sense of imagination is kinesthetic. If I
Mhm.
imagine something, I literally imagine my physical body in a space where I have a sense of things happening. I have feelings, I have emotions.
Mhm.
I can sense myself turning to someone. I can imagine I can't see anybody there. Um, and I first discovered this, in high school when we had to do these math things where you would be given
Oh, like
like things.
rotate things
Yeah,
in
and
space.
you're supposed
Yeah.
to rotate them in your mind and you could see it. And this was literally how the only way I could do it was I had to look at it. And there were like squares. But okay, Kelly, you're gonna walk 4 squares.
Mm.
And if you were there, what would be here?
Right.
And I'm like
Right.
literally trying to walk these figures in my head. And that's when I realized other people can see things. So, anyways,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, first of all, none of the stuff requires having visual imagery.
Right. And
Um,
1 to 3% of the population experience what scientists call aphantasia, which is just an absence of mental imagery when you try to think about something that's not immediately in front of you, right? So 97 to 99% of people can close their eyes and essentially see things that aren't there. Yes.
so cool.
Not you. I um, interestingly, for everybody, not just people who don't have mental images, but for everybody, the most powerful technique that I've play tested and studied in imagining the future is actually journaling from the future. So actually writing stories as if you had already lived through it. So, for example, with the Sun exit election, I would say, okay, open up a journal, write the date 10 years from the future. So it's April 19th, 2032. Put that future date right at the top. and then try to tell the story as if it had happened. Or maybe it's, well, tonight's when the election results come out. I'm really feeling, and then what emotion do you think you would feel? And who are you with? Like, my kids came home. So my kids are 7 years old today. So maybe I'm imagining in the future, like my kids came home early from, whatever debate practice or high school musical or whatever to like watch the results. So you're bringing details about things that might be different in the future. You'll be older. The world, will be different in certain ways. So you're putting vivid details in. And then it's not so much about like what you can see in your mind, but how specific and vivid and realistic you can make the story to yourself. Because what happens is you essentially create a memory of the future that you can then recall and use to make decisions, to make plans. You can use it for motivation. You can use it for inspiration. And if you imagine it vividly enough, whether it's in your mind or writing down these details, your brain will take it as seriously as something that you have actually experienced or lived through. And so by choosing to imagine, future scenarios that make us feel excited or that we want to feel ready for, so we want to imagine it as vividly as if we'd already lived through it, so we really feel like we know what we would do and how we would react. We can use our imagination to make it real for us in that
I
way.
love, this idea of a future memory is something that I've used a lot in my work on behavior change too. When you're trying to imagine that you can change something that feels really stuck, whether it's an addiction or a destructive habit, or a goal you're trying to reach, but you just haven't been able to make progress on, is to create that future memory where you imagine like a milestone moment that like what would be that moment that would be a turning point or something you would celebrate, and to really make it real. Because like, as you said, your brain treats these as these future memories as evidence that it then uses to support you in taking positive action or having confidence or having hope. Yeah, I love that part of the book and how you encourage us to do that. I also wanted to ask a couple of questions. By the way, feel free to add questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask a couple of other questions specific to our book club. So one thing we always ask is for you to make a book recommendation. It could be something you read 30 years ago or 3 days ago. And any book that you would recommend to people for any reason.
Yes. Okay. My number one book recommendation is Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. It could totally be a Joy Collective book. This is a book by a historian, an activist, and she talks about looking at incredible change that has been accomplished, or all of the amazing aid and help that we have managed to give each other during crisis, and trying to use that as a source of hope for what we might be able to change or how we might be able to help each other in the future. And so I really like about her, she's so practical and realistic about all the ways we suffer, but also, like, hey, remember when women couldn't vote? We can change some stuff. Remember when babies couldn't vote? That was so barbaric.
I also say that's something I appreciate about your book too, and your work in general, is it is this relentless realism, which actually is pretty unusual. You're like, hey, things could radically change. Some bad things could happen, some amazing things could happen, but I always feel like it's grounded not in like futuristic scenarios, like suddenly we'll all evolve to have wings, or maybe that'll happen. But like, it's so grounded in reality, this process that you describe as paying attention to signals. I did, by the way, when you told us in the book to download the risk report, I did and read it. Or I read the summary of it. But I really appreciate that. And so, yes, I could see how you would recommend a book that has that wonderful balance of pragmatism and acknowledging challenge while also taking an optimistic and hopeful view. Another question that I like to ask people, so the Joy Collective is a play on the term collective joy, which is the experience that we have when we join in with other people through some kind of shared activity, whether it's movement or celebration or competition or labor or whatever, play.
Mm.
And we feel like a part of something bigger than ourselves. And it often creates actually this sense of we agency, that it's difficult, that difficult things are possible and that we
Mm.
can overcome obstacles. So what is your favorite way to experience collective joy? And have you felt collective joy yet today?
Oh, have I felt it yet today? Well, okay. I want to say that uh, I believe we can experience collective joy by imagining the future together. We were just talking about journaling from the future. So the actual experience of participating in the types of massively multiplayer future simulations that I design
Mhm.
are you do these journals from the future, but then you share them with others, right? We create these social networks where it's just for you telling stories from the future, but everybody's telling stories about the same future, like the Sun exit election and how we voted and how we're reacting to the results. And somebody wrote on one of our forums at the end of one of these simulations, which sometimes they're short, they last for 2 or 3 days. Oftentimes they're longer, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. You've spent a lot of time really imagining this future with other people. Somebody wrote that they felt like they had just woken up from the most amazing dream, but it was a dream that they'd had with thousands of others of people. And I thought it really is like this way of dreaming together. There's some scary elements as we dream of crises or challenges we might face, but there's also like the superpower dreams where in these future stories we're telling, suddenly we're doing amazing things and we're overcoming our obstacles. So I do think dreaming of the future together is a
And
way to experience collective joy.
I do think like this is one of the best things about the games and the worlds that you've created is that kind of social sharing, because of course it creates also a felt sense of common humanity, that whatever you're in, you're not alone in it. And I'm sure that people who participated in some of those scenarios during recent crises, I'm sure they had a felt sense that they understood in like a really embodied
Mhm.
experiential way that this was not a personal crisis. I alone am the only one dealing with this, but a felt sense that people all over the world are also dealing with this. I wanted to pull. We have a few minutes left. I
Good.
wanted to
And
go to a
can
question
I
from
add one
Stacy.
thing?
Oh
Oh,
yes.
we always ask people in these games to say how you think you might help others, but we also make sure to ask, what would you need? What
Mhm.
help would you ask for? Because we want people to be able to see this future from other people's points of view and the types of needs that might emerge. And so, as you say, like you get this sense that it's not just your reaction or your feeling, but you get to see the whole constellation of responses, which, I mean, in terms of building serious next level empathy, it's a very constructive experience.
So, Stacy asks, do you think imagining certain realities through gaming could help with phobias? Oh, like fear of flying. Jane, you and I don't know anything about this fear.
Hey, we've tackled
Right here.
that fear in our lives. Okay, I mean, I wish I could say yes, but in fact, my approach to overcoming the fear of flying is my same approach to overcoming the fear of the future, right?
Okay.
Which is that the more information I have, if I can understand the science of how this works or how things might be fixed, then I feel comfortable. And for me, overcoming my fear of flying was taking an online course in all of the aerodynamics of an airplane and what the sounds, when you hear this sound, it's the wing is doing this or the flap is doing that or the engine is doing that. And just learning the science, like, oh, I get it, I understand how it works, it's not a mystery to me, I can be confident. And in looking towards the future, it's the same thing. If there's something I don't like, I feel worried about, sometimes I'll just go to Google and I'll try to manifest things that would make me feel better. Like, like cancer vaccine. Like if I'm worried about somebody I know being at risk, let me Google and see, like, can I find out any good news about the future, or maybe it's, what happened to universal basic income? Why don't we have that yet? Let me go type into Google News universal basic income and see, is there any good news that somebody somewhere is doing a bigger pilot or a new study came out? So for me, the gaming I do a lot of gaming, and gaming for particular purposes, but for me, the overcoming the fear is really exposing ourselves to information that could make us feel better, of having more facts that feel like we understand what might happen next. For me, is my strategy.
I remember you overcoming your fear of flying before I did, and you telling me that, and I was like, that's not going to work for me. I don't need the information. Like, I just don't want to be on the plane. Like,
Yeah.
I could tell you all the mechanics. I just don't want the actual experience. And so for me, I had to go to a values place where I had to look at my life and say, the one place where I was very clear that, one of my values is courage. And I was just letting fear completely drive choices about my life, not taking trips, not seeing family. And I decided the pain of feeling like I couldn't be brave was a pain that was worse than how much I hate being on an airplane. And that was it. And like, I still hate being on airplanes. And literally I have to make that decision every time. Is like, you know what? I just am going to choose this discomfort over the kind of personal discomfort of choosing fear. So Stacey, I don't know if that,
it's like a rational and a very deeply felt approach. Both work.
And I think like, so what we're pointing to is, I think when it comes to something like really big, scary change or difficult change, that you and I have both drawn on what is meaningful to us and finding our own strengths and meaning. And that's probably, the thing that we could recommend. Will we collaborate on a TV show together? Well, so Jane and I get approached for TV shows all the time, and never anything that I would ever want to do. Remember, there's going to be that reality TV show, which probably would have been us fighting with each other. Do you remember like years ago, they wanted to do like a McGonigal twin show? I was like, no, because it's just going to be us fighting. Like, not that we do in real life, but who would watch a show about us if it was just us talking about our pets and your kids? But you've actually done a show that was pretty interesting. And the show I would like to do is I would like to judge a vegan baking competition while adopting out cats, while also applauding people for their dancing. So if a producer is watching,
did I do a show?
You were a judge on like a Disney show.
Oh, it was a pilot. It was a pilot. It never made it to air. I know I could have been a Disney princess, but it didn't actually make it to air. I've always thought that this is a terrible idea. But I thought it would be great if it would be like a competition, truly this is a terrible idea, but we would have two people with like a similar challenge in their lives. And then you and I would each take one, or a family or a couple, and coach them I would use gameful psychology and games and future imagination. And you would use movement and meditation and mind body
and adopt them some animals.
Yeah. And then we'd see like who has the most powerful transformation. It'd be like a makeover show, but with like, neuroscience interventions. And anyway,
instead of Iyanla Fix My Life, it's like McGonigal twins.
Yeah,
please help.
But a contest, because
see, this is why I would not sign it, because I don't like games. So like, can we please not? Okay, we're gonna have one last question from Janice, which is a great question to end with.
Yes.
What would you say is the optimal way to read and participate in Imaginable? Is it to pause and do an exercise after each chapter, do the exercises later? And also, why don't you tell people watching this now who haven't read the book about the party we're going to have in 10 years?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Definitely.
And this will be it. So wrap it up. Anything you want to say? This is your moment.
Do all of the imagination exercises as you go, because they're skill building. And if you have a lived experience of practicing a skill, you're going to be able to learn the next skill more effectively. So do it as you go. But also there is an online community where if you want to find people to play the games with, a lot of the games just work better if you're playing them with 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. So there's a URL on the book It says on the back flap, you can see it says join the community at Urgent Optimists, plural, because there's about 1,000 of us right now playing the games from the book. And that way, you don't have to do it on your own. If you have questions, we're facilitating, weekly game nights and monthly scenario clubs. So you can come and hang out with me and everybody else to play the games, which I think is, the future is something that we do together as a community practice in the best of worlds. So wanted to create a community for people to do that.
And the party.
Oh, and the party. So there's a book club for Imaginable, but like a good futurist, I've set it 10 years in the future. It's actually in the year 2033. So there's a URL in the book. It says come RSVP. You can literally RSVP now, put it on your calendar, download the calendar event. And we're planning to come back and talk about what happened that surprised everybody else that we were not surprised for. We totally saw it coming because we were practicing future imagination. And also, what are we really proud to have impacted over the past decade through our own actions, our purposeful actions to shape the future. So I'm looking forward. Kelly, will you be at Book Club 2033 to?
Well, yes, my plan is yes. I hope so. And
Good.
I hope that we can do a dance party at it too.
I will absolutely. We will be doing the fix your circadian rhythms to match the lack of sun dance at the 2033 book club. We will, promise.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for being here, Jane. Thank you, Joy Collective members, those of you who are here because of our Literati book club. And thank you to everyone else who just found us some other way. Have a great next 10 years. Have a great decade.
Yes. If it's not 2033 yet, it's not too late.
If it is 2033, how do we do? We send us a message if you figured out time travel. Yeah. Let us know right now in the chat. What's 2033 like? Okay.